you were in the middle of your career with this, but can you explain to a millennial or maybe even like a Gen Z person what inspired you and John to write this story particularly? We'd love that.
Well, on one hand, it's easy, right? This was the largest takeover fight in American history at the time.
Mm-hmm.
There had never been anything like it. It was the closest thing to a civil war that Wall Street had ever experienced, meaning every major fund, every major investment bank had a hand in this. It monopolized Wall Street and the business world's attention for 3-4 months that fall. There just had never been anything like it. But the broader idea is, I was a newcomer to Wall Street to this point. I was not really a businessy guy. I was 27 when I wrote this. And I took the job at the Wall Street Journal because it was the best offer I got out of school, not because I was particularly interested in business. So I get to Wall Street. I'm covering the takeover market. And literally every Monday morning, you've got $3 billion to $5 billion LBOs and takeovers. Mm-hmm. This was in 87, 88. And there was, as kind of a normal person, not a business student, I thought, not only A, is this amazing, but B, most of the rest of the country, people like my parents, smart people, know something crazy is going on Wall Street, but don't understand what it is. And I thought there would be value there in explaining the complexities of what was going on in lay language to normal people. And every now and then in this publishing, lightning strikes, and it was a success.
So let's start out with one of the main characters in this story, Ross Johnson. Teach our listeners about his background up to Standard Brands, and then how did he become CEO
at Standard?
At Standard.
Oh, goodness. Ross Johnson was a nobody from nowhere, Canada. He was about as obscure an up-and-comer in the corporate world as you can get. He had a nice career there in Ottawa and Toronto. I'm going to lapse into a Canadian accent at any moment here, as we used to do when John and I would talk about Ross. We would always take on Ross's accent.
Sure.
He went up through through a series of mergers. He went to Standard Brands, a long forgotten American company, and then Nabisco, and then ultimately merged it to become CEO of this entirely new firm, RJR Nabisco, which was, we all know Nabisco products. And then he merged it with RJR Reynolds, the cigarette company. And, this was supposed to be, the great new company for the 21st century. And for a number of reasons, it was a disaster. But Ross was, I can't say unique, but he was definitely ahead of his time in the ways he thought of shareholder value. He really didn't think he loved his job, but he moved so often, he didn't think it was the job, the desk, the chair he was sitting in at the minute was the be all end all of his career. So he had no problem buying and selling in companies like poker chips. And that's kind of the mindset that he brought to American business that was a little bit interesting in the late 80s.
So one of the, because he came from, if I remember correctly, the sales side of this. That was kind of his background, was sales and the idea of creating products, is where he came through Standard Brands. But he was a lifestyle person. This wasn't a job, to your point just a second ago. This is a lifestyle, I think, is what Ross makes me think of. And we'll touch more at this later when we get into more of the Nabisco part of this. But he ends up in Standard Brands in New York. What was the lifestyle like for Ross? Like, how did he look at who he should hang out with, who he should, get drinks with, who he should get dinner with?
What was different about Ross stylistically, he was more casual than a lot of CEOs at a time where we still thought of CEOs. This was pre-Bill Gates. This was when people were expected to wear coat and tie still on Friday even. We thought of CEOs as silver-haired white men in charcoal gray suits. Ross was a little bit younger, a little bit hipper. He wore jewelry, which many people on his board hated. He cursed, and Ross was so full of life. I don't think the man ever frowned. Every other sentence was laugh. He just seemed to be loving his life and wanted you to love it too. I mean, his unwritten mantra was, we can make a lot of money and have a lot of fun. Coming up from the marketing side, as you say, the people he palled around with tended to be less the business roundtable types than Ross particularly loved celebrities. There's a word that we used to use in New York that we can't probably say out loud here. And Ross was one who definitely loved hanging out at celebrity golf tournaments with the PGA.
Sure.
As far as marketing with Standard Brands, and then with Nabisco, he found ways to bring in sports friends, from Reggie Jackson to Frank Gifford to Don Meredith, to help sell his products. And that's who Ross hung out with. He had a good time, and he didn't mind displaying it.
So, he comes in as CEO of Standard Brands, which you talk about some of the story of how he got to that point. Standard Brands gets put together with Nabisco. Can you explain some of the brands that were coming together at that moment? And even then, he wasn't the foreknown CEO of, what was going to be the new Nabisco.
Ross was a long time, number two. And, he always made very clear to the number one that he didn't want his job, that he was very comfortable where he was. I have not read the book in about 10 years, so I'm not calling up this. What were the Standard Brands? I can't even remember now. I remember the Nabisco brands.
Yeah, I remember the Nabisco too. But to your point, I think it was one of these like mergers that were put together on the idea they'd be selling to the same customers. And we all can name Nabisco brands, but Standard Brands is as in today's world, I think it was an afterthought.
Well, and that's what made sense about the tobacco business. It's all convenience stores, grocery stores. That's who they were providing product to. Yeah.
So let's pivot then. Could you teach our listeners about the history of Nabisco then?
Well, Nabisco, as I recall, was a creature of the early 20th century. And, it's one of the great American companies. I think most of us know it from Ritz crackers, but pretty much it was the P&G of chips and crackers. It was typically, much of the early manufacturing and the later headquarters was in, New Jersey. It was like P&G. It was that big of a monolith. And, Ross comes on via this merger. Nobody really pays too much attention to it. Standard Brands is about as dull as the name. Is there a duller name than Standard Brands? Nabisco, actually, which stands for the National Biscuit Company, as I recall.
Biscuit Company.
Was a much jazzier company. And Ross did what he always did. He came on as the number two, telling everybody he didn't want to be number one. But suddenly, he was best friends with everybody on the board, taking them out to breakfast, taking them out to the right golf clubs. And crucially, this is not to suggest that Ross was all gloss and flash. In fact, he was a pretty hard-nosed business guy. You could even say was merciless in that he had learned in Canada from one of his many mentors up there that the businesses that they oversaw always did better the more they were constantly shaken up. He always told guys, his subordinates, you don't have a job, you have an assignment. He would do things like take one division and, lop off the top 10 executives, assign them and switch them up with the executives of another division. And he found that as long as his subordinates, going down several levels, kind of were always on edge and always concerned that they could not be content, that they were constantly trying to prove themselves, he found that a powerful motivational tool. And I, looking back, think Ross was as smart financially as any CEO of his ilk. His real genius was for brand and personnel management, particularly. He was very good with people, mostly because he kept the best. He was smart about it, And he ended up through these years from Canada up through Standard Brands into Nabisco with a coterie of guys around him that he knew he could trust, that he could throw at Dole Pineapple 1 minute and, some cracker company the next minute, and they could do almost anything. And they would do almost anything for Ross because, he also motivated people by being the purveyor of all corporate goodies, not just bonuses, but flights on the jet, playing a round of golf with OJ. He kept his people having fun where he could.